listening to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens.
Welcome back to Hotel Bar Sessions. This is Jen. I'm joined today by my co-hosts Bob and Lee. Today we are talking about the hills we die on. But before we start talking about that, I'm going to go around the bar and get our drink orders. Also, I've got a couple of dollars for the jukebox, and I figure we need some good background music while we're talking about these difficult philosophical topics. So I'm going to ask each of my co-hosts to say what music do they want while they describe the hills they're willing to die on and what they're willing to let slide. Bob, we'll go ahead and start with you. What are you drinking, and what do you want your music to be today?
I've got a little bit of a nose cold. I need something to open up the passages, so I'm going to order an Armagnac today to get my passages cleared.
I don't know what that is. What is that?
Armagnac is a French digestif. It's kind of like a brandy. It's very strong. You drink it after dinner. It's good for digesting, and it makes you feel better in general.
Nice.
And it's only Armagnac if it comes from the Armagnac region of France.
Nice.
My musical choice today, last week it was the 45th anniversary of Remain in Light. This week, it's the 44th anniversary of the release of Laurie Anderson's Oh Superman. So I'm choosing Oh Superman, a fascinating track from her first album, Big Science.
Oh Superman. Oh John. Oh Mom and Dad.
The reason I'm choosing it is because it seems to be a timely song at the moment. I think it's about the promise of technology and the many ways in which that promise always fails. Laurie Anderson always was an early adopter of new technologies, even invented some technology for her own practice, and returns to this theme over and over, the progress that technology promises and really very frequently doesn't deliver on. She does it, again, in Home of the Brave, in a kind of reading of Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, looking backwards in horror at what has transpired in the name of progress. So, since it came out 44 years ago this week, let's put Oh Superman on the jukebox and despair a little bit about the state of technology.
While we drink a digestif to feel better. I like that combination. All right, Lee, let's head over to you because after all, we're going to be talking for a while, so we need another song to put on the jukebox.
I'm just going to have some hot sake tonight. It's gotten finally a little bit cooler here in DC, and I absolutely love that and really excited about the hot sake that comes along with it. My song choice today is going to be the classic country song by Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson called Mamas, Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys.
Mamas, don't let your babies grow up to be cowboys. Don't let them pick guitars or drive them old trucks. Let them be doctors and lawyers and such. Mamas, don't let your babies grow up.
The thing that I really love about this song is that in almost every way, it is a purely formulaic country song. It's about guitars and cowboys and trucks and being alone, even when you're with someone you love, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there is this moment, it's in either the second verse or the third verse, I'm not sure which, but they start with cowboys like smoky old pool rooms and clear mountain mornings. The next line says, little warm puppies and children and girls of the night.
I have questions.
I also have questions. Like, how did we go from clear mountain mornings and puppies and children to prostitutes? That is a very strange transition. I love these moments in songs that are otherwise formulaic when you get this just complete weird dissonant moment in the lyrics that makes you say, huh, What is going on here? Cowboys contain multitudes, as opposed to. So, Jen, what about you? What are you drinking and what are you putting on the jukebox?
I am just going to have a glass of the House Merlot today.
Oh my God, the fucking Merlot.
Will you let me like things, please? I'm just going to have a glass of Merlot. And my song today is Sleepwalking by All Time Low.
When you're gone, medicates till my brain goes on. Like a train where your feet won't run. Stuck in place, paralyzed, I feel like I'm sleepwalking when you're gone.
The lyrics perfectly describe when something happens in your life that's so incomprehensible that it just throws you out of sync with the whole world. But you still have to go through that world. And then it feels like you're sleepwalking. You know you're awake. You know the world is around you and you're doing stuff. But you just feel out of sync.
Yeah.
And I've been feeling that way a little bit with just everything that's going on in the world. And I also have to edit bylaws.
Yeah.
And so I think that song kind of captures my mood. So in an effort to stop sleepwalking, I'm going to turn us back to the topic of today's episode, which is the hills we die on. Lee, this was your topic and your idea. Tell us what we're talking about today.
I want both of you to think about that feeling you get when someone either makes a claim or challenges one of your beliefs and you tense up, like your pulse jumps, or you sort of sit up a little bit straighter and you think to yourself, no, not this, not here, not today. I think we all have lines that we won't cross. And, some of them are obvious and common and shared by most people, like don't target civilians. And others are maybe less important or at least quieter, like admit when you're out over your skis. These are all principles that we hold. But I want us to think about why some ideas become non-negotiable for us and how we tell the difference between courage and just simple stubbornness. Philosophers have for a long time really loved this terrain. Kant draws hard lines, Mill counts costs and benefits. Pragmatists will often say, but does it work in the world? Feminists and standpoint theorists often ask whose hill gets recognized as a hill at all and who pays when it's defended or not. Out in public, we see commitment praised. It seems like integrity to us. So you can think about a whistleblower who holds firm or a journalist who protects his or her source. That's conviction doing its best work. But when conviction spoils or becomes, let's say, impure, it really stinks. Online, we see this too. Content creators perform certainty like it's a virtue because we all know that the algorithm rewards the person who never blinks. So here's the question I want us to sit with tonight. What makes a hill worth holding? And what are the conditions under which you'd lay down your arms? And if your answer is nothing could change my mind, I think we have to ask whether that's strength or fear or vanity or whether the hill is actually you. I believe that if you've got a hill, you should also have a test for that hill. Can you steelman the best objections to your view? Can you name the evidence or harm that would make you revise it? Who bears the risk when you hold the line? So, listeners, we're going to be looking at cases where holding fast saved something precious and important, but also moments when stepping back was the real act of courage. And so while you're listening, we want you to think of one belief that you treat as sacred. Maybe write it down. Maybe underneath it, write what you think the strongest case against it would be, what your override conditions would be. All right, now that we've all got our hills in mind, drinks down, minds open, let's get into it. Obviously, we are going to talk about what our hills are that we are willing to die on. But before we get to that, I want us to just have a brief chat and try to define what we mean when we say a hill that you're willing to die on. Is it about belief? Is it an identity claim? Is it about sacred values or unbargainable values? What do you think when someone says, that's a hill I'm going to die on, they mean by that?
So I think this is interesting because my initial reaction was to want to push back on you when you talked about this being a sacred value. Because I think I would distinguish between a hill I'm willing to die on and a sacred value, where sacredness for me means something that's not open to question, open to counterexample, or open to discussion. Whereas the hills I'm willing to die on are things that I've thought about a lot. I've thought about the override conditions. I've thought about the counterclaims and why somebody might disagree with me. And I've said, nope, I'm going to plant myself like a tree and everybody else needs to move. I think there's a distinction there that's kind of important.
When you, Jen, focus first of all on sacred values, I don't have any relation to what that means, because I said in the last episode I'm a rabid atheist, and I can't think of a sacred value that I would lay down my life for, stemming from any metaphysical system. Lee had better examples for me, like, don't plagiarize. We have that rule in comedy too, don't steal jokes. Those are things that people who are in the practice, whether it be teaching to avoid plagiarism or comedy to avoid plagiarism, it's a red line you do not cross. I was trying to think of some examples of hills that I would die on. And I came up with two, and as I thought about them, I realized that actually my position on them has changed over the last decade. So I'm not sure that these are hills that I would die on, or rather the hills took on different shapes over the time, or some new general moved into my head and changed the strategy. One of the examples is shame. For the longest time, I thought that shame was a severe retardant on human growth. It made us feel bad about ourselves. It made us feel bad about our bodies. It made us feel bad about our behaviors. It made us unwilling to take risks. It was not good for us. And now, because of, I think, probably some fairly obvious situational developments, I think we need more shame. We need desperately have you no decency, sir, kind of moment, right? And it's not just for politicians. That's for all the Karens out there who are still getting all up in people's business, and for a whole host of other individuals who just, it seems to me, no longer know how to behave in public. I think we need more shame, but we need to deconstruct it. We need to reverse and reinscribe it and come up with an archy-shame in some way so that it's no longer about our identities or about our bodies or what we do with our bodies, but instead about, just civility. It's a hyper-mega dose version of humility in public. So, what hill would I die on there? If you asked me 10 years ago, I would have said less shame. If you asked me now, I'd say more shame. And the second example, I am now very pro-queer. I do not like laga batata caca or legitimate or whatever we're calling ourselves now, LGBTQIABC plus. The plus is for premium.
Paid subscription only.
I hated queer for the longest time because my last name rhymes with it. So that was the insult of my youth, the queer. Oh, it was very clever. And I hated it. I was reviled by it even. It made me shrink, and that has something to do with shame as well.
Yeah.
And now, since I don't like the letters so much, I'm very pro-queer. I think it's an umbrella term that covers everybody. On the one hand, we have people willing to exclude certain letters from the alphabet for political reasons. And on the other hand, we have other letters who are trying to get into the alphabet for different reasons, and they should be. We should all be in there. We should all be queer. And I know that there's some pushback on this because people of an older generation in particular really don't like that word. It has a very negative connotation. It was the insult of their life.
It was a slur, right?
It was a slur. And even some people of younger generations have a problem with it because it doesn't really define them in some way. They want to say gender queer or two-spirit. And well, it's all queer to me. So right now, use of the word queer to describe the LGBTQ, Q is for queer community, is maybe a hill I would die on. And that comes from identity.
Yeah.
To refer to your other question.
Yeah.
Oh man, Bob, I immediately want to start talking about shame and the LGBTQ plus community, but I want to come back to the initial question that Lee started us with, which is what is a hill we die on And why do we think about it this way, right? So I'm a philosopher of war and peace. And so one of the things that immediately struck me is that this is a military metaphor. In military parlance, the hill is the high ground, and you hold it and you defend it against all comers. That's how you win a battle. And if we win enough battles, the thought is that we win the war. Now, of course, anybody who knows anything about military history is going to be like, well, that's not how wars work. And I will say that you are correct. But it is a metaphor. And I think it's a really telling metaphor because it immediately sets us up for conflict. Here's my hill. Come at me, bro. Like, is that how we're supposed to be doing philosophical conversation?
I like the fact that you bring up its metaphorical nature, because when I think about the hills that I would die on, most of them are not hills I would actually give my life on. They're places that I would dig my feet in. And so when I say this is a hill that I'm going to die on, I'm saying that metaphorically. This is very important to me. This is a battle that I want to fight. But would I actually take a bullet for it? No. And I think the instances that we would actually die for an idea are probably few and far between for a lot of people. And just to go back to Bob's objection to the use of the term sacred, I think we could call sacred values, even though they may have nothing to do at all with God. They're just sacred to us in that sense, that they're as precious to me as my own life. I think that those are probably few and far between. I have many, many more hills that I would die on metaphorically, right? Like, I'm really going to fight you about this. I'm not going to budge. As you said earlier, Jen, I'm going to plant my flag here and you just have to move around it. This is my dance space. That is your dance space. Right? So,
I mean, I will definitely punch a Nazi in the face if I have an opportunity.
So, Lee, how do you decide which battles are worth fighting and which aren't? Because I think that's what's behind these are the hills I'm willing to die on claim. Because sometimes we have students who say, I'm going to die on every single hill. We've all had this experience. And you're like, put some battles back. And then we all have students who are not willing to make any claims. And we're like, pick a hill.
yes.
Yeah, and one of the earliest pieces of advice you would get when you're a young academic new to a department is choose your battles wisely.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think how those choices are made is something that we really do need to talk about, because there are different traditions that are going to give us instructions or guidelines or whatever for how exactly to choose our battles, how exactly to recognize the hills that we're willing to die on and the hills that we're not, the hills that we shouldn't even climb in the first place. That's why I mentioned in the introduction Kant and Mill, pragmatists and standpoint epistemologists. All of these people have different guidelines for how it is that we recognize these hills or how it is that we fight on them. For me, probably most hills that I would say either literally or metaphorically are hills that I would die on are determined on principle. They're not cost-benefit analysis hills, ultimately. So they're Kantian hills.
But then it's always the Groucho Marx quote. These are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others.
I just had a real life situation recently for another organization for which I do volunteer work. It's very rule bound. It was my view that they had misinterpreted the rules over something, and I had proposed an amicable solution. They didn't want that. They wanted to play by the rules. So I said, okay, if that's what you want to do, and studied the rules very, very carefully and pushed it all the way to the end, and then embarrassed them publicly because, you know, they had an opportunity to avoid all of this and wouldn't take it. And they wanted to play by the rules. So they wanted to die on that hill. And they did. I killed them on that hill. But it was a principle that I was defending.
Yeah.
People were misconstruing, oh, this is a personal thing or whatever. But no, there's a principle to be defended here. And it wasn't about me. It was about that principle. It was about the correct application of rules stemming from the organization's bylaws. And so the bylaws had to be upheld. The principle had to be upheld. We could have done it amicably or we could have fought about it. We chose to fight about it.
Yeah.
But there are principles all over the place. And so I think my question is, how do we choose which principles we're going to defend? Lee, you mentioned Kant and Mill. I could go back to Foucault here, who tells us that all systems of meaning are systems of power, and say which principles you think are important is just going to be a function of the systems of power that you live in. But Bob, you seem to be referencing something different. You seem to think there are principles that are capital T true. just ought to be defended? Is that what we think are the hills that we should die on? And if so, how do we pick those?
Well, you're asking two questions there. I mean, yes, I think those are the hills we should die on when they have to do with principles. But I don't believe in capital P principles. I don't believe in things that are handed down by Moses in 10 commandments.
How many commandments do we have?
It's an old Mel Brooks joke, just like the fucking Merlot was for the fans of Paul Giamatti out there. But a principled stance is worth defending. In this case, it was about fairness in elections. Those are not capital P principles. They're not written in stone anywhere, but they nevertheless are rules that we have all in good faith agreed to and said these are the rules that are going to govern our organization. And if we're willing to let one of them go, then how many others are going to follow?
Okay, two things. One is I think that we have to distinguish between rules and principles.
Yeah.
Whether with a capital P or a lowercase p. I think that rules are something that we can say, look, we've all agreed to these, whatever. We're acting on the principle of good faith or trust or some basic principle of functional sociality. In that sense, whatever the principle is, has to be something that can be explained to another person. And when I say every hill that I'm going to die on principle, is not really about, is the principle something that exists in some Platonic world of forms, but rather, is it something that I expect if I have a conversation with someone and they disagree with me, there is at least the possibility that I could show them the error of their ways. And if they want to fight me about it instead, I'm not willing to budge, even if that means my life, literally or metaphorically. So that's what I mean by principles. And I don't think, Jen, that those principles are all over the place. I don't think that they are. I think that they're pretty few and far between. They often get conflated with other things like norms or opinions or structures or rules, but they're fundamentally different things.
Good. So I think that's a really helpful distinction. And then my question is, how do we think about those principles in our day-to-day lives? Because one thing you might think is, this is a principle that I've come to and developed over time, and I believe it strongly. It would be a belief.
Yeah.
The other thing you might think is, I am thus and so a person, and thus and such a person believes X. And so because I have these character traits, I hold on to this principle. One of those seems more movable than the other, because anything you think as just a belief is open theoretically to revision, whereas this is the kind of person I am. I'm a Kantian. Philosophers talk this way all the time. I'm a Kantian, I'm a utilitarian, I'm a just war theorist. And those kinds of claims carry with them principles, but it's more of an identity claim than a belief claim.
Well, I completely agree with you. And I do think that principles can also be revised, as Bob pointed out earlier in his discussion of his changing beliefs about shame and the value of shame. So I think principles can be based on our beliefs, our commitments, let's say, whether they're philosophical commitments or political commitments or whatever. But I also agree with you that they can be based on our identity. And I want to use a different identity example than I am a Kantian. I mean, I don't think that I would die on the hill I am a Kantian, by which I mean not that I wouldn't dig my heels in on the basis of Kantian principles, but rather that if someone was like, no, you're not a Kantian, that's not a hill I'm going to die on. However, if I was a person who really believed that it was incorrect to call me a woman or to call me a man, that is an identity-based principle that I might be willing to die for. And unfortunately, many, many, many trans people and queer people have died for.
Yes.
To say, no, this is who I am. I will try as much as I can to convince you otherwise, convince you to change your mind about who I am. But I'm not climbing back down this hill. And if I have to, I'll die.
Yeah, that's a particularly good example. And a particularly timely example as well. I mean, trans women are women, trans men are men, full stop. For me, that's the end of the discussion. Jen, you were talking about different examples, philosophers saying, well, I'm a Kantian. If somebody said that to me, I would be concerned for a variety of different reasons. I mean, when I say things like, I'm Kantian on this point, or I'm adopting a utilitarian perspective in this situation, I think this is the majority of students' experience as well when they take a class on moral theories. very rarely do they commit fully to any one position. They want to pick and choose. They want to have kind of like an ethics or a moral toolbox that is situational. In a certain situation, maybe a virtue ethics approach is going to be more fruitful than a consequentialist approach or a deontological approach. And I think that's okay. I don't think that's wishy-washy at all. But if somebody just was Kantian through and through, I would probably not want to have drinks with that person.
What if instead of saying I am a Kantian or I am a utilitarian, someone said I am an atheist?
Well, I mean, those are my people.
Right, but I don't see how it's any different.
No, it's true.
Or if
No, it's,
someone said I am a Christian, it's still a philosophical position in many, many ways.
But what I'm trying to get at is when it comes to moral frameworks, and I think when it comes to identitarian frameworks, we're not one thing. Unless that one thing is a disco ball. There's lots of different facets on that disco ball, and they all sparkle in different ways. But the way they hit you in the light is dependent upon a number of different things. So I'm not a Kantian, I'm not a consequentialist. I am an atheist, but I'm also this, and I'm also that, and I'm also something else. I'm a disco ball.
Like cowboys, you also contain multitudes.
Exactly. Hey there, dear listeners. You know, everybody agrees that the best time of the conference is after the conference is over and we're all hanging out in the bar having discussions. It's our social hour. And speaking of being social, you should be following us on social media. You can find us on Blue Sky, YouTube, and Facebook. And in all three of those places, we're at Hotel Bar Sessions. So please follow us on social media and keep the social hour going.
I want to bring us back to the point you made at the end of the last segment, where you talked about us containing multitudes, because I think that actually drew out something I've been concerned about so far throughout the conversation. I want to make a distinction between these kinds of big identity claims, which I don't think are principles, as Lee was kind of talking about, and particular content claims. So I'm not comfortable saying something like, I'm a Kantian or I'm an atheist, and having that be a hill I'm willing to die on, because that elides so much content that it's not even helpful as a claim.
Yeah.
So if I said I'm a Kantian, the immediate next question would be like, what does that mean to you? By contrast, if I say something like, war always represents a failure, because all war is atrocity, which, by the way, is a hill I'm willing to die on, that is a completely contentful claim that then you and I can have a discussion about. And we can have a discussion about the content of the claim, not about your identity. And so I think we can distinguish really helpfully between very specific content claims, which I think are hills I'm willing to die on, and these sort of broad claims that I think some people think are hills they're willing to die on, right? They're planting their flag. But I wouldn't describe those as philosophical hills to die on.
I think what you're describing are principled claims. I think that's what I was trying to get at in the first segment. Any hill that I'm going to die on is going to be a principled claim. Now, I think that that's probably because, like Bob, I'm not as invested in identitarian claims as other people rightly are. So that I am not does not mean that there aren't people who are rightly invested in identitarian claims, and that there might be certain hills that they're willing to die on the basis of identitarian claims. But for me, they're going to be principled claims, and those principled claims are going to, as you said, have to include communicable, rational content.
Well, I think part of what we need to recognize, just in line with your point, Lee, is that in the United States right now, we are seeing a fight over identitarian claims, and the fight is about the identity of the United States. Those are identitarian claims that people are fighting about.
Yeah.
But I think for us, philosophers, we're going to look at those rational, principled claims. Bob gave us two already in the first segment, claims about shame and about the LGBTQ plus community. Lee, I want to know, what is a hill you're willing to die on?
Oh, I was really hoping I had dodged that in the first segment.
I mean, points for effort, but no.
I think that one hill that I would die on is something like due process or the rule of law is fundamental to functional human sociality and political health. And so I think that I would die on the hill that any society or polity that I am involved in that has given up on the rule of law or due process. So an authoritarian, a fascist regime, that is a hill that I would die on.
But see, that's super interesting because immediately I want to say a lot of societies throughout history have not had due process or rule of law, and they at least functioned.
They didn't function for everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, they still don't function for everybody, but they function better for more people than they did in the past.
For sure, I think that's true. And then my immediate question is what constitutes functioning? So you added political health, and that again just raises a series of questions about what do you mean by that?
You can argue that Golden Age Athens was a functioning democratic society.
For dudes.
Exactly, for dudes, and for dudes who were born in the particular polity, not for those who immigrated. But the government did provide resources and manage resources for the population at large. And that population at large produced a whole lot of great and glorious things. Okay, women were excluded and slaves existed. Maybe the Athenians would say that's just the price. Between ancient Athens and our own, most democracies and republics were of the same sort. They were more exclusionary than they were inclusionary, but could be described as functioning insofar as they were providing something, at least security, maybe food, for the population at large. We're better, perhaps, because we work hard to include more people.
But that's a hill I'm willing to die on, is that no human being is disposable. No human being is kindling for great and glorious things. So we might say Athens produced great and glorious things because women were objects, enslaved folks were objects. Children weren't really considered to be people. Yes, they produced Socrates. And also, I don't care, because they did this other thing, which is why, Lee, when you said what you said about functioning societies and political health, I immediately was like, I need to know what that means.
Well, this is not going to be an answer to what does a functioning polity or society look like. That's a much bigger question. But just to get back to your point, Jen, I think if you're going to say something like, I believe no human being is disposable, no human being should just be collateral damage for some other purpose, no human being should be a mere means to an end, that is a principled hill upon which you're going to die. But how is that guaranteed? By laws, by due process. And I am a very strong believer that you cannot legislate people's hearts and minds. You can only legislate their behaviors. And so if I agree with you on that principle that no human being is disposable, the only way I can live in a society in which there are going to be other people who don't believe that is to believe even more strongly in the rule of law by due process. And so that's the hill I would die on.
So for you, due process is the principle that guarantees the health of a polity that aims to be inclusive and equitable in its protection of every member.
Yeah, and let's just go back to me on top of this hill, this due process hill, right? And I've dug my heels in. Who am I fighting? Or rather, what is the person that I'm fighting claiming? They're claiming that due process is not important, that the rule of law is not important. Well, what are the alternatives? It can only be something like authoritarianism. That's the only alternative. And so if I give all of the arguments, my principled arguments for the benefits of the rule of law, which include, I think, human sociality and political health, and someone still says, nope, we're not going to have due process, we're not going to have the rule of law, we have a king or we have a god or we have a ruler, and they make the decisions, and like it or not, too bad, that is a hill that I'm willing to die on.
So I think in response, I want to make 2 points. The first is a meta point about the conversation we're having. Because when you staked your ground, notice what Bob and I immediately did. We immediately started trying to drag you off that hill or make you defend it. And I think that actually says something about this notion of the hills we die on. It goes back to that military metaphor I was talking about at the beginning. When you say there's a hill you're willing to die on, you immediately invite combat. I'm not sure that's the best way to think about principles, but it might be, because I too have principles I'm willing to stake my ground on. Stake my ground on? I too have principles that I'm willing to plant myself like a tree and hold to. But I think it's interesting that immediately our instinct was to attack.
Well, let me give you an example of someone staking their claim on a principled hill and willing to die for it, and yet not necessarily inviting combat in the way that I think that you're describing. And that's Socrates. Famously, in Plato's Apology, Socrates is a philosopher in Athens. He gets dragged in on trumped up charges about not believing in the gods and making the stronger argument the weaker, which, thank God, people can't be killed for that now because there'd be a lot of people in danger. But at any rate, he has a trial and he gets to make an argument and he's convicted and he's sentenced to death. Does he fight it? Kind of, I suppose, but not really. He doesn't invite combat. He says, all right, here are my choices. I can either completely betray my principles. I can say, all right, I'll leave Athens. All right, I'll stop doing philosophy or whatever. Or I can accept my fate. And in this case, climbing down the hill is not an option for me. So I guess I'll just die here. I don't think that that's necessarily inviting combat. I mean, I suppose there was the rhetorical, ideological combat of the actual trial, metaphorically speaking. That's a kind of combat, I suppose. But in the end, I don't think that he really was fighting it.
In your attempt to move away from the military metaphor and find another one, you went for this idea of the oak tree. You're planted a tree, you're going to hold firm, hold fast. And that's exactly the same kind of language that Plato and Socrates used to describe courage, one of the four major virtues. Holding fast to your conviction or holding fast to what you know is true, to be the truth, is one of the key virtues that a philosopher should have. It's the virtue that the man who escapes from the cave and then goes back down to try to convince the others that they need to look the other way and not at the screen displays. And that courage is not always advantageous. That guy is going to be roundly attacked for bringing this good news of the outside world. So standing on a hill, defending a position, requires a kind of virtue, this virtue of courage against all comers.
Bob, I'm glad you said that because that made me think of two things. The first of which is that the story of Plato's cave always confused me because I always want to ask, who did the chaining up? Why are there people chained? And can we talk about the background conditions? But secondly, it reminds me that there's courage and then there's stubbornness. So there's being courageous, there's holding fast. There's saying, okay, I went up, I learned some truth, I know this is the truth, and I'm going to hold on to that truth. And then there's pushing that truth onto others in a way that is going to cause you and your community often a lot of harm. So I'm reminded of quietist pacifists. There are a lot of folks who are quietist pacifists. They say, I'm a pacifist, I think all violence is wrong, so I will remain silent. And then there are pacifists who say, I believe all war is wrong, I believe all violence is wrong, so I'm going to get out there in the world and try to make a more peaceful world. I think both of those folks are courageous, but I also think sometimes that can lean over into stubbornness and it can lean over into being foolhardy, which Aristotle describes as when the virtue of courage goes too far.
Often when we remain on a hill, fighting on a hill, because of stubbornness or because of ego, that is, as I said in the introduction, maybe evidence that the hill is actually us and not the principle that we're allegedly defending. I think a really, really good recent example of this is Joe Biden's refusal to step down from the election. I think that that is an example of someone who believed that he was making a principled stand, that believed that he was digging his feet in for a good reason and a reason that he was willing to articulate. But at the end of the day, his investment, I think, in himself and his own ego ended up being what he was standing on that hill fighting and not the principle that he was articulating as the reason that he was on that hill fighting.
He, I think, really believed that he was the only person who could beat Trump.
Yeah.
Allegedly, he kept asking people, do you think Kamala could win? Do you think Kamala could win? Long before it was too late for him to withdraw. But then that moment passed and it was too late.
Yeah.
So there was this mixture of concern, right? He thought he was doing a principled thing. He really believed. But then there was also this stubbornness where he really believed. So that whole notion of, I really believe this principle can cut both ways.
Yeah.
Yes, he was being principled, but yes, he was also being egoistically driven and quite stubborn. And that is a big thing that sent the election to Trump.
Yeah, and that's a really tough position to be in when you find yourself on a hill, losing a battle, and your friends are whispering in your ear, this is not the hill you want to die on. Like, pick your battles. It's very hard to see from the perspective of someone who is passionately fighting on principle or believe that they are passionately fighting on principle to see that, in fact, maybe they're not. In fact, maybe this is actually an identitarian hill and not a principled hill.
Yeah.
That this is about me.
I think that's a better way of putting it. And I think I want to save the word identitarian and not make it a synonym for egoism or egoist.
That's a good point. Yeah. Conceded. I accept that friendly amendment.
Well, that'll avoid a 45-minute procedural vote.
But then that's so difficult because where is the line between holding the principle, doing it because of ego, and then falling off the edge into something like fanaticism, where it's not quite ego? I think I would want to distinguish. But it's this idea that this is something I believe and my community believes, and if I stop believing what my community believes, I'll be ostracized. I'm here thinking about folks who get out of cults and they get interviewed, and the interviewer always asks, why did you continue to believe this thing? And the interviewee says, well, I had to cling to that space of belief because I knew my community would abandon me. That edges us over into fanaticism. And here you can look back to Socrates. So when the night before his execution, Crito is like, come with me in the boat. You can live to philosophize another day. And Socrates says, no, my principles. And I've always read that passage as Socrates falling a little bit into fanaticism.
I think that's not an unfair reading. However, I do think that many fanatics are often not actually willing to die on those hills.
Say more.
I think, for example, of flat earthers. Like, flat earthers seem fanatical about that belief and seem to believe that it's a principled belief. Are they going to sail off the edge of the earth? I don't think most of them will, right? Whereas I'm happy to get on a boat and sail around the world. I don't think I'm ever going to fall off the edge. If I'm wrong about that, that is a hill I'm willing to die on.
Fair.
I mean, I think there's a difference there, an important difference there. I'm not saying that there aren't, of course, people who believe things so fanatically that they're willing to die for them. I think we see this in a lot of cults. Like, what was the Jim Jones Kool-Aid place?
Oh, Waco.
No,
not
Jonestown.
Waco. Jonestown.
Right? Or Waco, right? I mean, they're both examples of the same thing.
Or MAGA.
Yeah. Pick your thing, right?
She's going to cut
No, I'm not going to cut it out. I'm just trying to think of examples of where a large group of MAGA people have ever put their lives on the line.
Well, but like think about the SS in World War II. Don't think about Eichmann. Eichmann's actually a bad example here. Think about the SS troops. They kept putting their lives on the line for this belief that we can look back at and say that was a fanatic belief.
It's a bad form of reasoning that leads them into accepting all of these ideas as truth. And then they are unable to deviate with that truth, even when they are confronted with a vast deal of evidence to the contrary. I mean, flat earthers have nothing to fear but sphere itself. At least there is, some reason to be optimistic with them. There's this famous clip of a leading flat earther who is taken to the so-called edge of the world to see the curvature of the globe. And it is demonstrated to him beyond a shadow of a doubt that the earth is not flat. And he says at the end of all of this, wow, I was wrong. There is always this possibility of redemption for people who are so committed to certain ideas, even fanatically committed to certain ideas, that they can be turned toward the light, just as the cave dwellers are.
I like this example because it reminds me that in order for there to be bodies left at the top of a hill, both people have to be on a hill they would die on. The best case scenario is that you're on a hill that you're willing to die on and are able to persuade the other person of your principled view, or vice versa. You're objecting to someone who is on a hill that they would die on. and they're able to persuade you. That's nobody dies in that example. That's the best possible example. The reason that I was a little bit resistant to Bob's claim that MAGA are fanatics in the same way is because I just don't see any evidence that they're willing to die on the hills of their principled beliefs. And the best example I can give of this is the fact that all of these new ICE agents and Homeland Security agents and the like that are now taking to the street and allegedly putting themselves in danger for the principled beliefs that they want to defend or endorse are also wearing masks, are also wearing guns. They're not actually putting their lives at stake, despite the rhetoric about Antifa or the radical left. They're not putting their lives at stake.
I think I would distinguish between January 6ers and then ICE agents. And just because you're willing to put your life at stake does not mean you're not willing to defend it. That's the guns and the mask thing, right? Saying there's a hill I'm willing to die on doesn't mean I have to be willing to die with no weapons.
I just don't think that they're willing to die for these beliefs. I think if it actually were as dangerous as the current administration's rhetoric wants us to believe it is for police officers on the street or ICE agents on the street or Homeland Security agents on the street, if it actually were that dangerous, I think there would be a lot fewer people who would sign up for those jobs.
I think that's right, but I think they're willing to kill for it.
That's exactly what I was going to say. They may not be willing to die for it, but they are willing to kill for it. Mm-hmm. And they are willing to bend the limits of reason to maintain a conformity to it. So maybe fanaticism is, in any of its forms, not a great example of a hill you're willing to die on, but it is a phenomenon that is maybe sort of like the mirror image, you know, like in Star Trek, when they go to the mirror universe. That's a hill I will die on. Anybody who says Star Wars is the superior star has got a problem.
Bob, they're just different.
But I think for myself, I would say the hills that I'm willing to die on are almost never, I would say never, hills I'm willing to kill on.
So I think that's a helpful distinction, because then we can say there are hills I'm willing to die on, there are hills I'm willing to kill to destroy. And I don't know if the ideal situation is we persuade each other and I get MAGA or the SS troops to like trot over to my hill of democracy and rule of law and due process, kumbaya land. Or if there's a middle ground where you're on your hill and I'm on my hill, but we can wave to each other. Nobody's invading anybody else. Is that a possibility? Because I think that might be the middle ground between barren plains of compromise and wholesale slaughter.
Yeah, I think in that instance, I would just say now we're not talking about hills anymore.
Yeah, that might be
We're
right.
just shopping in the dairy section at Kroger.
Good fences make good neighbors.
Okay, so maybe Hotel Bar Sessions podcast is not NPR, but like NPR, we are also not receiving public funds anymore. Actually, we never received public funds. We have always been supported by you, our listeners. And to keep this podcast going and to keep our bar tabs open, we need your help. So please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hotel Bar Sessions and sign up to be one of our regular supporters. If that's a little bit too much of a commitment for you, no worries. We've also got options for one-time donations that you can make through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App on our website. Just click on the Support Us tab at hotelbarpodcast.com. Every little bit that you can contribute helps defray the costs of what we do here and helps keep our Hotel Bar Sessions tab open and your Hotel Bar Sessions episodes flowing. Thanks in advance. We really appreciate your support. And now, back to the conversation.
You know, we've been talking about hills that we die on, and around the margins of the discussion, sometimes right through the center of the discussion, there's been this question that hasn't yet been answered that I think is worth asking. How do you know if this is a hill or the hill that you want to die on? We talked about having principles. We talked about how having principles may differ from being a fanatic about something, but we haven't yet described any sort of test that we might apply to determine if this is the principle I want to defend, this is the hill I want to die on. And there are lots of different kinds of tests available. As I get older, one of the tests I apply is this going to be important in 5 months? And that's mostly for, organizational bullshit kind of stuff in order to preserve my own sanity in those situations. But, generally speaking, I'm not going to get involved in some sort of drama. I'm not talking about hills to die on anymore, but I'm not going to invest myself in any sort of drama if it's just not going to be important in a finite amount of time in order to preserve myself. But in a similar vein, Lei, Jen, what do you do? How do you check the defensibility, the desirability to defend a particular hill?
I think for me, I need to ask myself, what could possibly change my mind? And if my answer is nothing could possibly change my mind, I need to be able to give an account to myself of why that is. And if the why of that is not a principled account, if it has something to do with me, then that's not a hill that I should die on.
So what kind of intellectual framework then do you use to ask those kinds of questions? We joked earlier about being a Kantian or a consequentialist. What kinds of frameworks do you use to check those kinds of boxes?
Well, I think a Kantian framework is a good framework to use to check those kinds of boxes. Is the principle that I'm operating on a principle that one ought to operate on? Not just me, but one ought to operate on. It's just a formulation of the categorical imperative. Is this legitimately a principle and not an opinion or a belief or a preference or whatever, but is it something that I could reasonably expect someone else to have their minds changed about, and I could not expect any other reasonable person to disagree with?
Well, another reasonable person could apply reason and conclude that, the categorical imperative says something other than what you think it does, that you have somehow made an error of reason in your deliberation and you're wrong about the hill. One example of this that I use, the famous example is the murderer at the door. But another good example that I use is homosexuality is contrary to the survival of the human species. Yes, you ought to be able to think rationally and in a Kantian way to say that the homosexual person, I'm using this 19th century language, has every right to exist and do as he or she sees fit with consenting adults. And every individual should be accorded that same privilege and freedom. And on the other hand, yes, the survival of the human species is a desirable thing. So in the event of some sort of, nuclear catastrophe or viral event where all heterosexual males are suddenly rendered sterile, then homosexuality would be incompatible with the survival of the human species. Right? I don't even know what I'm talking about anymore. But,
it's not an uncommon argument. I don't know that any of this actually points to a deep understanding of what the categorical imperative requires, nor do I think any of this necessarily constitutes advocating behaviors that are contrary to the categorical imperative. I don't see that. My worry is that if someone were to say to me, you've just misunderstood the categorical imperative, or I'm using my reason in my own way to reason through it differently, I would say, as I often do, because of course, having taught philosophy for 20 years, I've encountered these arguments every semester. I would say, okay, people are wrong every day. Let me explain this better to you. I very strongly believe that when people say my reason or your reason, meaning capital R reason, that they're misusing the term. There are certain things that reason can do and reason can't do. It does have limits. And so when people say, but I can use my reason to say X, I think that they're mistaking little r reasons for capital R reason.
Yeah, they are. And somebody is making an error of reason, right? It's
Yes.
either you or the
Yes.
other person. But you're convinced that you're not doing it, and they're convinced that they're not doing it. So how do you navigate then, aside from just you trying to persuade the person that they're wrong and they're trying to persuade you that you're wrong, if you're both equally convinced that you're absolutely right?
Oh, I don't think there is a navigating of that, and that's why it's called a hill that I would die on.
So death is the only out.
Well, the point there is I'm not willing to navigate this.
But I think we can make a distinction between being willing to navigate, Lee was the word you used, which suggests a willingness to come down from your hill and like find a middle ground, contrasted with remain in dialogue. So I was going to say, Bob, in answer to your question, I'm a feminist, so I'm immediately going to go to feminist relational autonomy here and say, when I'm having a dialogue with another person where they're convinced they're right and I'm convinced I'm right, the thing I'm immediately going to do is try to open up that dialogue to other folks. How can we have repeated conversations, bring in other resources, bring in other traditions, bring in other thinkers to see if we can make headway to find where the error in reasoning is? So it's not a navigation of coming down the hill. It's they're on their hill, I'm on my hill. We're both totally convinced. Who else can I pull into this fight? So it's not just me fighting alone.
Well, I think that's probably good strategic advice, but now we're changing the conditions of the scenario that Bob gave me.
Well, exactly. I didn't like it, so I changed it.
The conditions of the scenario that Bob gave me were you're not budging and the other person is not budging.
Yeah.
Now, in reference to what I said earlier, if both of us are on a hill that we're willing to die on, one of us is going to die. There's no navigating it at that point.
That's
if
right.
I'm not budging and they're not budging and both of us are going to die on that hill, then that's it. That's the end of the story. And I think that there are hills that I would die on like that. And if someone else came up my hill and wanted to challenge me to a fight, metaphorical or literal, I would not go back down the hill. That would make it not a hill to die on.
Let's try a different scenario. I mean, all three of us are or have been professors, and it's clear that all three of us do have political opinions. But, sometimes our duties as citizens or duties as someone who has those particular political opinions or commitments may conflict with our professorial duties. When we're in the classroom, we should be neutral, right? In terms of expressing political views. It doesn't mean we should be both siderists, but we should be neutral. And especially in this day and age, which is increasingly perilous for speech in the classroom, how do we, what's the way to put this, navigate or deal with the hills that we would die on as personal citizens versus our duties as a professor?
I think this is an important question. I also think, by the way, another hill that I would die on is that the classroom ought to be an antagonistic place and ought to make space for exactly these kinds of battles without death, battles not unto death.
Oh, I would agree with that, yes.
But I think that this is something that happens often in the classroom. I will play the role of X who is standing atop a hill that they would die on. It's very easy for me in the classroom to separate my own personal beliefs, my own personal principles, and the hills that I personally, outside the classroom, would die on, and the kinds of arguments that constitute the kinds of arguments that I would oppose on the hills that I would die on. I think it's very important to demonstrate, to animate for students exactly what those arguments would look like from someone who would die on that hill, even if it's not a principle that I share.
So I agree with that because I want to disagree with Bob that the professor in the classroom should be neutral. I think there's a distinction between being sort of neutral in the sense of being quietist, where I'm not going to say what I think, versus saying, here's what I think. Here are the principles I hold, the hills I'm willing to die on, and please, 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 students, disagree with me. Give me your best reasons and arguments. Let's have the conversation about this. Because I really dislike devil's advocates. I will often say to students, the devil has enough advocates.
Yeah.
Say what you really think.
That's a really interesting approach. It's not my approach in the classroom. I almost never say to my students, these are the principles I believe in. These are my political beliefs. These are my personal, sacred values or whatever. I almost never say that. I almost always operate in the role of X persona that is taking X position. I think that makes it much easier for me, anyway, to have conversations with students in which all of the arguments can be flushed out without anyone feeling like they personally are choosing a hill to die on, and especially a hill that they think that I personally might not agree with. I'm not sure if my approach is playing the devil's advocate. I don't like to think of it that way. I can see how it might be described that way. I also don't like devil's advocate arguments when they're used as sophistry or, playthings. But I do think that it's important sometimes to separate who I am as a person and my role in the classroom as a pedagogue.
So I'm not saying there's not a difference. What I'm saying is that I think it's very helpful for students to see that these arguments matter.
Yeah.
That this is real, that they're not just intellectual exercises in the world. So I will often say to students, hey, here is what I really think. This is like the Jen view. And then I will follow that up with, it's also true that Jen is wrong a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So this goes back, Bob, to your initial question of what would it take to change my mind. I tell students all the time, here are the current beliefs that I hold. Please argue with me because I'm wrong a lot of the time, and what it takes to change my mind is a good argument.
Jen, this is so helpful because I think this might help me articulate a little bit better what I was trying to say earlier, which is that when I'm testing this hill, right, which is the question that Bob kind of led us with, when I'm testing this hill and I'm asking myself, is this a principle I am willing to die on, or is this a principled hill one ought to die on? That is the important difference for me. And so when you say, I want students to be able to see why it matters, what the stakes of it are, your answer to that is, let me attach it to a person that they know, a person that they respect, a person that they trust, namely me, their professor, Jen. For me, I think it's much more important for them to be able to understand why something matters and the stakes of it separate from me or separate from themselves.
That's really helpful because I think arguments only matter because people matter. But that comes out of me being a social and political philosopher. So I'm not in the classroom discussing logic or metaphysics or possibility. I'm in the classroom discussing things like interpersonal ethics, war, peace, oppression. And so I connect these arguments to me to show students that the reason we ought to care about what the world is like is because we ought to care about the people in it. That's a hill I'm willing to die on.
Yeah, I'm with you on that hill. I'm right up there with you on that hill.
Thank you. Come join me. We will fight together.
I'm just trying to say that for me, also a social and political philosopher, a moral and political philosopher, teaching probably the exact same content that you do, or at least the exact same questions, that is not my pedagogical approach. Like I said, I totally respect that approach. I just think for whatever reason, and it probably is the closet Kantian in me, which is like at this point in the podcast, not even in the closet anymore.
Come out,
like,
come out. Just be in the open.
I'm literally
it's
wearing an airbrushed t-shirt with Kant's face on it. So at this point, I think that might be the Kantian in me. It's important for me that students can understand the value and the significance and the stakes of arguments without having to attach those arguments to themselves or to me. And the reason I think that's important is because if an argument is always attached to a personality, it becomes much harder then to hear the arguments of a personality who might be new to you.
Yeah,
so it's
that's
very
helpful.
difficult if I'm not a trans person or if I've never had a professor who is a trans person to put myself in the shoes of a trans person and hear what they're saying. But if I have the skills to understand the stakes of an argument that are not necessarily attached to me, that may not matter to me, then I think that I have the skills to be persuaded or decide not to be persuaded by the arguments of someone who is in almost every other sense a stranger to me.
I'm not surprisingly somewhere in between you two, I think, on this particular point of pedagogy, in that, I want to hear the students. I start from them. I start from their views. I try to meet them where they are and let them articulate it and then lead them to the universalizing moment from the me to the one that Lee has referenced earlier on. I don't make it about me. I make it about them because they're not interested in me. Sometimes they ask me, well, what do you think?
Yeah.
And I say, you don't really care what I think. You're hoping that I will say what I think so you can duplicate it on the
That's
exam later and then you'll get an A. But I'm interested in what you think and, more importantly, how you think. And so my job as a philosophy professor is to help improve, if I can, the how. Not the content of your thought, but the how you think it and the way you make arguments and the way you defend those arguments. So I try to lead them from where they are to where I think they should be, which is, as Lee, I think, elegantly put it, from the me to the one. One ought to do this. So I don't think that makes me a closet Kantian. I'm a closet a lot of things, but Kantian, no.
I think one thing that's helpful here is to point out that not everything is a hill I'm willing to die on.
Yeah.
So I feel like I've sort of made myself sound like this person who has all these wild beliefs. I have all the hills and I will die on all of them. And that's not true. I'm just trying to say that in those cases where it comes up, which is not all the time, I think it's important to say, yeah, for me, Jen, this is a critical claim. I've been wrong before. I'm likely to be wrong again. Let's have a talk about it. I also think it's helpful to point out a secondary thing, which is there's a distinction between having a hill you're willing to die on and being willing to fight about it at that moment. I have lots of hills I'm willing to die on that I'm not willing to fight about right now.
Yeah, well, choose your battles, right? So, Jen, you just gave an interesting thought there. You say you're wrong all the time. You're almost sitting out there in a booth that says, prove me wrong, and asking your students to do it, right?
Yeah.
You're delighted to be found wrong, and if you are, you concede. Lee, what does it take for you to concede? If you ever do, you're one of the most convinced people I know.
It was the euphemism of the century.
What does it take for you to say, okay, I was wrong about that hill?
I mean, I think a well-reasoned argument. I mean, I know that sounds like a formulaic answer, but it's true.
Has it ever happened?
Oh, yes, many times. I've been convinced that I was just absolutely misguided on some principled stand. I do want to say one thing that is kind of coming out in this interchange right now that hadn't really occurred to me before, but now might constitute another hill that I'm willing to die on, which is, just to go back to the classroom, I think the thing that I want students to know about me personally is simply that I have hills that I will die on, that I am a principled person. And I think what I want to teach students principally is to have a hill to die on and to be able to defend it. Yeah. I often say to students, if you don't have a hill that you would die on, you need to find one.
I
you
agree
need to
with
find
that.
one.
That's right.
And so I think that when I say it's not about me, it's not about, the longitude and latitudes of my hills, like where they are and what they look like, but just that I have hills. So that I do want them to know about me. And I think that is best demonstrated rather than narrated. If I tell them I'm a principled person, there are certain hills that I would die on, I'm not sure that that's as educational as showing them what it looks like to be willing to die on a hill.
So I think that's exactly right. And I think that's what I'm trying to do when I point out the hills that I'm willing to die on. I'm trying to encourage them through demonstration. Hey, find a hill. If it's my hill, fantastic. If it's another hill, also fantastic. Learn how to defend it.
I'll see you at dawn.
Exactly. So it looks like Bartender's giving us last call, but I do have one quick question before we go. We've been talking about very serious socio-political hills that we're going to die on, but we're all philosophers here, which means I know we have some esoteric hills. So what's the weirdest hill you're willing to die on?
I think I already stated mine. As far as stars go, Trek is superior.
Fight me.
Fight me.
Mine is that the formula for a good song is 3 chords and a sad story. What about you, Jen?
The weirdest one I've got? Late night TV reruns are the best kind of TV.
Oh, interesting.
I love a late night TV rerun.
Golden Girls.
Yes! I want to be a Golden Girl. It's my life's ambition.
You'll get there eventually. Well, we've been wandering through all sorts of hills here. The hills are alive with the sound of mucus.
Oh.
No, that was a dad joke. I'm so sorry. Yes. Wandering through the hills and exploring what it means to have a hill to die on. And along the way, we've maybe taught each other some things about pedagogy as well.
Definitely.
So this is why what happens after the lectures at the conference in the bar is always the best session.
Cosign.
Heard.
Thanks, you guys, for this conversation. It's been really helpful for me.
Yeah, super awesome. Thanks all.
See you at the next conference.
Catch y'all next time.
See ya.